Hiya and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where I'm speaking to Wyn Evans from Shared Voice, who help people get planning permission, which is obviously something we all need, as long as it's the right planning permissions for the right things in the right place. And basically that's what Wyn helps with. He helps us get good stuff done. So Wyn, thanks for coming.
Thanks for inviting me, Paul.
Good. So look, I love what you do, and I love the way you do it. And we'll obviously get into the detail of all of that in a little while. But before we start, I always like to know how you started. Where did it all begin, and how did you sort of end up doing what you're now doing?
Well, I did a planning course at university, and at university sort of got dragged into politics. My first job was in the world of politics. I ended up working in Westminster. I became a councillor incredibly young. I think I was the youngest councillor in London at the time. That was many years ago.
Wow. How old were you and where were you?
I think I was about 21, 22 in the Royal Borough of Kingston.
Wow.
And I was there for 6 years and gradually got quite frustrated with it. And I then sort of went into the world of public affairs, and because of that background, I inevitably, I suppose, increasingly sort of focused on the built environment sector and planning, and it's what I've been doing ever since.
Very interesting. Now, when you were at Kingston, just out of interest, you didn't end up on the planning committee at all, did you?
I wasn't on the planning committee, but there were some of the really big applications were referred to the full council. So there were a few applications that went to full council that I would have been involved in. But I tended to avoid the planning committee, given that I was sort of in that world of work anyway. So
interesting, because I always like to know how things look or are perceived in development from the sort of other side of the fence. Not, there shouldn't be a fence, but unfortunately it feels like sometimes there is. So okay, so that's interesting. So you actually studied planning.
I studied planning. Well, it was actually called urban development. What happened in the 80s, obviously under the Thatcher government being very anti-planning, they decided to get rid of all the planning courses. So the university I went to decided to rebrand it urban development, but it was effectively a planning course. It was exactly the same. And then when sort of planning came back into fashion, I think it was rebranded back into planning. But to all intent and purposes, it was a planning course.
Very interesting. So, well, I know we haven't gotten to the shared voice yet, but the whole politics of planning, because we've sort of stumbled upon that, is massively interesting. And the fact that, there is almost like fashion in it. Things go in and out of fashion, and next thing it's the key thing. And to be honest, from a developer's point of view, it's one of the things that really sort of pisses me off, to be quite honest, because the fact that it's been chopped and changed about so much, it has often meant that you sort of don't know where you are. You may well spend, as from a developer's point of view, a long time working on something, thinking, that you're dealing with things in a certain way, and then the goalposts get moved, and then it's completely something different. So I think that's a big problem. What are your thoughts about the politics of planning?
Well, I think you're right. I think those things are a big problem, but ultimately what drives all of those things are public opinion. And when you either get a new government coming in, as we've had recently, or when there's been a government that's been in place for a while, that constantly shifting public opinion, pressurizes whether it's councillors or MPs to take decisions on planning applications or change the goalposts on planning policy, because the pressure is coming from their electorate. So in many ways, the last 40 years of planning policy have all been driven really by the attitudes of the public. And what we've been trying to do in Shared Voice is really look at that and try to shape public opinion, because ultimately public opinion drives decision making far more than anything else. If you're a councillor and you're on the planning committee, if you've got 100 people supporting a scheme, regardless of how many objectors there are, it is so much easier to support that scheme, because you're able to be responding positively to what at least some of your voters are wanting.
Yeah, absolutely. So So before we get on to how you help with all of that, let's just have a little chat maybe about what has been, I think, a big part of the problem, which is, you know, there are some people that, you know, they don't really like the term NIMBYs, right?
Yep.
But there are people, of course, that, you know, that term exists for a reason. There are a lot of people that don't want anything anywhere near where they live, irrespective of how much it's needed or how good it is, because it's human nature and people just don't like change. So there are such things as NIMBYs. There really are.
Yep.
And you know, they are, in my opinion, one of the big problems when it comes to planning and development. Just a quick word to say thank you to our sponsors, LandTech, creators of Land Insight, which is the industry-leading bit of software to help developers find and analyse the potential of real 100% off-market development opportunities. I've been involved in the business for over 10 years now, and if you don't know what it basically does what people like me used to have to do the old-fashioned way, which is hunt around and get together all of the key information that's needed in order to make sensible decisions on the development potential of land. So that's planning data, market research, lists of all of the various constraints, environment and agency information, you name it, massive long list of all of the stuff that you need in order to find out who owns land, what policy constraints there might be, and exactly what you may or may not be able to do with it. All of the industry leading developers use it, and also the most clued up smaller ones. So if you're not already using it and you want to trial for yourself, have a look in the show notes. You'll find a link to get a free trial, test it for yourself, see what you think, and hopefully get busy finding real off-market development opportunities. So thanks again to our show sponsors, LandTech, and let's get back to the show. Before what is your sort of view on NIMBYism? I'm going to say it's a big question, but what have you got to say about that?
Well, there are people out there that don't want any change. They don't want any development. But the one thing about them is they are very, very small in number. So if you look at any opinion poll and you ask about attitudes towards development, what you find is actually the majority of people support development in their own area. But what you've got is a small number of people that do not want any development at all. And I think one of the areas which both the development world and also the comms world within the development sector has failed is that they focused all of their time talking to, we think it's 6%. We think 6% of the population strongly oppose development. And what has historically happened is that the way developers engage through their sort of PR consultants is they sort of send a flyer round to the local community, or they encourage people to a website, and they frame the debate about, look, we want to develop this site, we want to change this site. So who's going to be motivated to get involved in a debate that is framed in that manner? It's going to be people who have anxieties and concerns about what that change means. So you send a flyer around, and you might get 100 people to an exhibition. They're all anti, they're all against. The local councillors are there, the press might be there, and it creates a perception that everyone from the community is against development. But you might be in a town of 10,000 people. That 100 people is just 1%, and they are the NIMBYs, and they are the people that dominate the discussion, dominate the debate, and create this perception that everyone is against development, when in reality, the people opposed to development are pretty small in number. So what we've been trying to do at Shared Voice is look at ways in which we can start engaging the people on the other side. And when we set Shared Voice up 4 years ago, one of the questions, the first question we asked is, why is it that every opinion poll tells us the majority of people support house building in their area, but those people never get involved? And we then started doing our own focus groups. We started message testing through social media. So we took the traditional narrative that developers have and the way they engage people, and we tested them in sort of small chunks on social media. And what we got in response was either zero engagement, or if there was engagement, it was completely negative. And we realised the whole way that developers frame the discussion, the way they communicate their plans, does nothing to motivate the people on the supportive side. And we then started working, looking at ways in which we could motivate those people to get involved. And we ended up developing our own brand, which I think you're aware of, Paul, called Just Build Homes. And Just Build Homes now is, I think, the only service in the UK that connects supporters of house building with the planning process. And what we do at Just Build Homes is we talk about people's housing aspirations, people's housing needs, and we get into almost like a completely secondary sort of debate with those people. And they sort of tell us, their stories, whether it's, about housing, specific housing need, that they might be a family living in one bedroom and being on the council waiting list for 3 or 4 years, or whether it's people, in a nice house, but they might want a bigger garden, or another bedroom because one of the kids are getting a bit older, or a spare room as a study. And all of these people have an aspiration or a need for housing in their area. And what they often tell us is they've been looking and they can't find anywhere. So then when you start introducing the discussion, well, do you think we need to be building more homes in your area? They all say, well, yes. And then when you start introducing schemes to those people, by saying, well, look, there's a developer who literally is down the road from you that wants to build 50 houses or 100 apartments or whatever it might be, they generally respond pretty positive to it, because we've started a conversation with those people from a different point. Yeah. We haven't talked to them, hey, this is a site, what do you think? We've talked to them about their housing needs and their housing requirements, and they get involved in that debate. And the fact that if you look at sort of, daytime TV, if you put on, BBC One or ITV or even BBC Two, the chances are there will be a housing programme, whether it's, find a place in the country or find a place in France or help us find the right place in Sheffield or whatever it might be. People are really interested in that debate and that discussion.
Yeah.
And I think we in the comms world, in the planning world, have been really lazy in the sense that we've just taken architects' drawings, we've shared them with the community, and the only people that are interested in that discussion, that debate, are the NIMBYs that you refer to. Yeah. And of course those NIMBYs have a right to have their say and to object, but actually there's a whole host of other people who want to see these things happen, and we think if you engage with them in the right way, you can bring their voices out too.
Very interesting. I tell you, one of the things that always amazes me is that, people, like you say, they're interested in property. Most, if they don't own their own home, they aspire to it, or they certainly used to anyway. I know, things we're told are changing. I don't know how true that actually is. It's probably more like people would love to own their own home, but things have just got so crazy unaffordable for lots of people, particularly younger people, that they've maybe just given up on it. But I still think that in an ideal world, of course, they would probably love to own their own homes. I think, but one of the things I think is interesting is that certainly in terms of the NIMBYs, and actually I think even the sort of public in general, most of them live in houses or flats built by property developers in places that at one time were fields, and I don't know how and where they think the homes come from, because when we're trying to create new ones, it's like a big problem. Well, how do they actually think this stuff happens? Because certainly from a developer's point of view, it's really not easy getting this stuff created.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. But the other thing probably to be said about public opinion is not black and white. It's not we support housing or we are against housing. There's a whole myriad of views. So for example, one of the things that we're doing now more and more with clients is doing genuine opinion research. So it's not the 100 people that come along to an exhibition who are basically all anti, but we will take a genuine sample of a community and sort of delve into quite a lot of detail about their housing wishes and their housing requirements. And we recently did a survey in Lichfield in the Midlands, and Lichfield has one of the highest levels of home ownership, and it is actually, I think, one of the sort of, by average age, one of the oldest districts in England. So you'd expect the sort of numbers of people who are anti-development to be higher in Lichfield than in other areas, and generally the research shows that. So it shows more people are against development in Lichfield than are for it. But when you start sort of digging down and you start asking people sort of more detailed questions, you get some really interesting responses. So of those people in Lichfield that do not want any more housing, they also say the council should be doing more to help their children stay in their area. So how do you? So these people aren't necessarily they're anti-housing. It's just the way that the debaters, once you start talking to them in those types of detail, you find actually there's a whole range of views, and actually even those people that say we're against housing will actually start articulating arguments that justify the need for more housing, if that makes sense.
Really interesting, because it was one of the things I was really going to ask you about, is about demographics really, and the sort of age, the views of different sort of people in different age ranges. So in my experience, it's been historically, well, you've only got to go and look at years ago. The typical way to consult was exactly what you just said. You do a public exhibition, you invite people along, and 95% of the people coming along were older people. Yeah. Possibly because they had more time on their hands, but possibly also because they were more stuck in their ways, I'm going to say, and just didn't want change. I don't know. Nowadays, I think that seems to be changing a bit. I don't know if it's just because the messaging has got a bit better, or because the housing crisis has just become so massive that the can can't be kicked down the road anymore. The impacts of the lack of housing, certainly affordable housing, is becoming so massive that it's affecting everyone, even the people that are all right sitting in their big houses all paid for, possibly because their 40-year-old kids are still at home living with them because they can't afford to move out.
That's absolutely right, and we're finding that sort of all the time. Generally, as a rule, if you're in an area where you've got a higher number of younger people, a higher number of renters, you will find more supporters. But what's also quite interesting is, certainly amongst that older demographic, there are now more and more people saying precisely what you've said. They're really worried that their kids can't find a place, and what's a real emotional pull is they're really worried that their kids are not going to be able to find a place near them, and that's a real motivating way to motivate people to get involved in a positive way. A couple of years ago, we were asked by a later living developer to come and help support them and start, getting supportive audiences involved in the debate. And we thought, well, the whole Just Build Homes narrative, the whole brand, it's really aimed at younger people and it's aimed at renters. How's this going to work? And it really surprised us, actually. We got some of the best results we've ever had on those later living schemes. And there was two reasons. One is the younger people were totally supportive of later living because they realised, well, if you create this purpose-built product here, we're going to have people leaving family homes and moving in there and freeing up family homes for them. But we also had a huge number of people who were not necessarily wanting to move into later living next year or in 3 years or 5 years, but are already thinking that I'd love to stay in this area. I love all my friends are here, my family are here, and you know, I'm now in, you know, there's me and the husband, and, you know, we're in this sort of 4-bedroom house. We need to look at something, you know, that's more appropriate. And they saw this as something which they might want to move into maybe 5, 10, 15 years' time. And we're really supportive. And we got some of our best response on later living from both a sort of younger audience who saw it was an opportunity to free up family homes, and those sort of older sort of demographics who saw this as a, you know, the next step for them.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I've actually got a classic example of that. So I've got quite a big site in Bromley at the moment, in sort of south-ish London, just outside, and very, as you all know, conservative local authority, historically very difficult to get planning for anything, and we're actually going for a retirement scheme, partly for, you know, if anything is going to be, and again it's very, you know, very political. I mean, look, planning decisions are always very political, but some places more than others. Bromley has always been very, very difficult. There's been quite a vociferous, you know, anti-development lobby, typically older people. And part of the reason for, you know, going for what we're going for is, you know, we're actually going for something that the people that object actually need. So if anything's going to get support, you would hope that it will be things like that, you know?
Yeah. Well, Bromley is a really, really important borough in the story of shared voice. So basically, going back 10 years in 2014, my former company, 40 Shillings, were appointed by Biggin Hill Airport to help them on their plans to grow. And I brought in a company called Forefront Opinion Research. And our sort of pitch to Biggin Hill was that, you know, we've got to understand what the public genuinely think about the airport, and what they think about the plans, and then we can frame a narrative around that. And the perception was, both from the airport itself and also all the councillors, was that everyone hates the airport. And our research showed precisely the opposite. It showed us that everyone actually loves the airport. They love the heritage of it. They love the fact that, you know, the role that the airport played in World War II. The people that lived in Biggin Hill village or town also loved the fact that their town had basically been built around it. So there was a real passion for it. And when you talked in terms of growth, they were really anti it. And when you started to understand why, what they thought was there was a secret plan that you're going to get EasyJet or Ryanair come. And that was never the plan of the airport's not interested in a Ryanair or an EasyJet. And what they're interested in doing is getting private aviation and then building a community of businesses that can support that private aviation. That's their business model. But that's quite a difficult narrative and story to tell. But we ran a whole host of focus groups, and from that work developed a narrative which was absolutely true in terms of the aspirations of the airport, explained what their plans were, and we helped motivate over 30,000 people to support the airport's plans. And after that, we said, well, if we can do that for aviation, surely we can do it for the housing sector. And in about 2016, 2017, we went to some of the bigger house builders. And we said, look at this model, let's have proper opinion research, let's do our opinion polls, let's run our focus groups, and we're pretty convinced we'll be able to develop a narrative that will support you. And we did actually get 2 developers signed up to that. And we didn't get any insights, nothing. And we were back into the situation that, you know, we didn't have a narrative, we didn't have a story, and all the objectives and both those schemes sort of were refused. And it was only sort of a couple of years later when we got back together with Forefront and we did more our own sort of opinion research on. We did an attitude survey in London, and the response just blew our minds. We did this survey across London of all age groups, and it just showed massive support for house building. And when you actually broke it down amongst renters and tenants and private rented tenants, the figures were just extraordinary. And it was then that we sort of started thinking there must be a way that we can tap into that sort of inert support. And that's ultimately how Shared Voice came together with another director who had a background in sort of digital journalism, and we put the three things together. But it took a lot of time, a lot of research, but we finally got there. But it was much tougher. And the reason we failed in 2016 and 2017 is we got too stuck in the detail. We got caught up in the weeds, all the detail about the scheme. And it was only, 3-4 years later when we took a step back and we looked at the bigger issue that we realised actually we can develop a narrative here which appeals to the public and works and motivates them. And I think, one of the things that's probably happened in the world of development, certainly around the comms in planning, is that we've been so caught up in the detail that we've failed to see the bigger picture, and we failed to communicate that bigger picture. And as soon as you start communicating it, you start to engage with people in a positive way.
Yeah. I get it. But I tell you, there's a bit of an interesting problem with some of this as well, which I think that a lot of the general public, and perhaps even planners actually, certainly planners, don't really understand, and that is all around viability. And that is linked. So now I don't know what happened in those two examples you just gave, but I do know that, and this is definitely one of the things that's going to annoy the public, I would imagine, and certainly planners and stuff like that, is when people are trying to pretend that they're consulting, but they're not really. They've already made their mind up, and they're effectively trying to force through. I mean, it works the other way as well, actually. I mean, I've had this with planners and planning meetings and even discussions with the government. They say they're consulting, but they've got their mind made up and they're just going to go and do what they were going to do anyway. Okay, so obviously that isn't right, but there is an extent to which you can only sort of consult so far. So, for example, I've had situations in the past where let's just call it a full 100% open consultation, and you show them a bit of land and say, what would you like to see happen here? And people will say nothing at all. Turn it into a park. But from a housing supply and development viability point of view, of course, that's not really going to happen. And then after a while, they might say then instead, okay, 10 bungalows. Yeah, but again, and I think this is one of the things people really, really don't understand. And the talk is about greedy developers, which really drives me around the bend, because of course there are some greedy ones, and one of the reasons for starting doing this podcast and the whole training business and some other things I do is to get rid of greedy developers and teach them and show that that we're not all like that, and there is a better way of doing things. But the fact of the matter is, the real issue is around land values and viability. And the fact of the matter is, landowners need to be incentivized to sell. We have to meet or beat a certain land value in order for anything to happen. Obviously, we need a reasonable profit margin to make it worth our while for what is a massively capital intensive and risky business. Yeah. So what that generally leads to a certain quantum of development. So we've got to have in some form or other X thousand square feet, whatever it is, of space, in order for this to even be viable. So there's like a tricky balance of like, well, what do you want? But by the same token, it has to be something a bit like this. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I also think, though, in this discussion, there's a difference between consultation and communications, and I think certainly from our part, we're in the communications world, and I've worked on some schemes which where we brought in sort of more specialist, genuine sort of consultation sort of organisation. I'll give you one example. A few years ago, we were working in a town in the Midlands, and they wanted to build an urban extension of 5,000 homes. And one of the first things that the developer did was they appointed a couple of facilitators to invite 40 stakeholders from the town, mainly a few councillors, resident association, business groups, to spend 2 days to set a design brief. So they were going to build 5,000 homes. There was no debate about that. And the first hour was taken up with a lot of angry people saying, well, that's completely wrong. And effectively, these facilitators said, well, you know, that's the planning framework. That's what we've got to build 5,000. If you don't want to be involved in this debate, just leave now, just go. But we want to set, you know, a design framework. We want to set a set of guidelines which the master planners will work to. And of course, those people, after being threatened with that, even though they're really anti any development, they all stayed. And they then are invited, just through probably a half-hour discussion, to establish 10 design guidelines, like 2 cars per household and very, you know, nothing more than 2 stories. And they wrote down the 10 guidelines. And then they spent the next sort of day and a half doing a whole host of exercises, including walking through the town and, you know, this is what we like, this is what we don't like. And at the end of the 2 days, they came back and they went through those 10 sort of points, and they crossed out 7 of them, and they almost like put the opposite, because once they'd really thought through them. So we now had 10 established points, which had been through genuine consultation with the community, well, with community leaders, and to inform the sort of plan moving forward. And that was great, and that's fantastic, and it should be, you know, applauded. But there's a few fundamental problems with it. First of all, we engaged 40 people. The town had 40,000 people, so you can't go through that type of exercise with 40,000 people. The second problem was that a lot of these people were chairs of residents' associations, and when they went back to their residents' associations and were trying to explain, well, these 10 principles are right, obviously everyone else in the room was saying, well, no, they're not. And the third problem with it is that when you went back to those people themselves, 6 months later, they'd completely forgotten the exercise they'd gone through. So, yes, there is a role for consultation, and, you know, there are ways you can do it, but our primary interest, really, I think, is more on the communication side. And it's about sort of how do you, and I think it's in many ways, one of the problems with the way that we've traditionally operated is we invite that, you know, that 6%, I call them that 6% of people who object to house, we invite them to these events, we let these people frame, you know, the discussion, and then the rest of the views, the supportive views, are ignored. So from our perspective, and I think what probably sets, you know, what places us unique is that we're interested in engaging with those supportive voices and bringing them out, and we think that has a bigger impact on the planning process. It gives councillors the confidence to approve schemes. I'm not saying you shouldn't do the consultation, and that's fine, but I think it has its limits, and that there's a wider communications role that in many ways is more important.
Yeah, very good. And so, I mean, I think in my experience, things do seem to be changing a little bit, even with, well, it's so interesting. Look, planners, let's just take it, you know, for forever, you know, the planning department was called development control.
Yes.
You know, now more recently, it's development management.
Yep.
You know, hopefully at some point in the future, it might be the development facilitation department,
yeah,
or the development help department. That'd be nice. But you know, obviously committees. Well, I mean, that's another big discussion actually. And maybe we should go down that rabbit hole about planning committees and the quality of committees. How are they? I mean, is it working? Because when you've what you know, in my experience, what tends to happen is, say, you get the 6% that are down the town hall with their placards. And then you get the 94%, or well, actually, I don't know, let's just say 50% or a large percentage that actually would quite like what you're proposing, but of course they've got better things to do than be down the town hall with placards on a Wednesday evening. So you know, I guess, I don't know, it's a question really, you know, you're still going to get the vociferous minority with their placards and all the things they do, and then but obviously, I guess how, you know, I don't know how it works. Let's just say you get the supporters. I mean, how does that message get to the planning committees, and how much notice do they actually take?
That's a really good point. But I think, first of all, it's worth understanding the pressure that councillors are under when they're on planning committees. There probably are councillors out there that just want to oppose everything, and they get to every committee and they object. But actually, most of the councillors that I speak to are not anti-development. They want to see things happen. They want to see change. But the problem is, you know, they look at their inboxes and all they hear from are objectors. They go onto the local community Facebook pages and all they see are objectors. And then if you are in a public meeting, if you're in a planning committee meeting, they're public, and you've got 50 people, 100 people in the gallery, and they're all anti. The easiest way to manage that, if you are a councillor, if you're a politician, and you're interested in those people's votes, is to actually just play to the gallery and give them what they want. And that happens across the country. And it's why, you know, in our view, we think it's so important to bring out that supportive audience. But communicating that to councillors is really important as well, because what we primarily do is try and encourage, you know, the supportive voices to submit comments onto the planning portal, but not everyone goes to the planning portal to read it. So it's really important that you communicate that to councillors directly. We've actually just started a new product called a Statement of Community Support, in addition to a Statement of Community Involvement. And it's submitted as a formal document to the council, but it's also sent to either all the councillors or all the councillors on the planning committee. And it's basically an analysis of all the people that have submitted positive comments, you know, who they are, you know, where they live, what the demographics are. And on some schemes, we've had like 86% of those have been non-homeowners. My guess is that probably 100% of people who normally respond to planning consultations are homeowners, but we're getting some extraordinary demographics. But also we go into what they're saying and carry their quotes, and so we communicate that with councillors. I think it's really important we can do that. We're also now asking people whether they would be prepared to come along and speak at the committee. That's a really big ask.
Yeah, I bet, yeah.
It's a really big ask. And a lot of people will say yes, but when you actually go back to them and explain what's involved, it's a bit of a daunting thing. But we have now on 2 schemes actually had local residents go along to speak in favour of planning applications. And at one of those, the committee were completely bowled over. They said, we've never had anyone come here to speak in favour of a scheme. And I think there were like 100 letters of support and like 2 letters of objection. And it was so easy for them to make the decision. And so we obviously can't control the number of objections. At the end of the day, you know, if there are people out in the community who are motivated to generate numbers, it's quite an easy thing to do. So, you know, there's very little, you know, a developer can do, in my view, to stop the number of objections that go in. If there are people that are minded to, you know, encourage their neighbours to do so, they will get those objections in. But I think we have demonstrated through Just Build Homes that you can reach those audiences that do want more homes and do want the homes that they need, and you can get them, you know, into that debate, and you can get them their comments into the council. But I think what you've just said, communicating that to councillors, is really important, because if you're a councillor and you've got 100 objectors here and you've got 100 supporters here, it is so much easier, you know, and even if there's only, you know, everyone in the public gallery is anti, it's so much easier to say, well, I know that you're against and that you're really anti this, but there's a load of people in our community who are telling us they want this housing because, and they could read out a couple of the comments. And it's almost then, if you're a councillor, you can almost put those arguments to one side and you can say, look, you know, there are people for, there are people against, but we've got to sort of focus on the planning merits. Does this meet the planning policy? And it's easier for them to deal with the objections that have been submitted. So In our view, you know, motivating that sort of supportive audience is going to be absolutely critical. And I also think as well, with the change of government, there's been a complete change of outlook in terms of attitudes towards housing. There is a massive push now from central government that local authorities have to deliver the housing they want. And, you know, already I think we're seeing that at planning committees and councillors knowing that, you know, that the government is breathing down their neck. And if they don't approve some applications, you know, they are, you know, they could be put into special measures or whatever. So I think we're already seeing more applications approved at a local level. But once you've got, you know, that strong national leadership and you compare, and then you combine it with local public support, it's a strong combination. And I think, you know, that combination will be the way that we get applications through at a local level.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love it. I mean, it does. The sentiment feels way more positive. So hopefully it'll stay that way and it will filter through to actual delivery. And I think that statement of community support is fantastic. So I can one of the things I always say, we're planning. The name of the game is you've got to do their job for them. You've got to make it easy. So you within reason, we know what the issues are going to be. We know what the objections are going to be. You need to deal with them, design around them, before you've even started. I mean, that's I think how you get planning. I'm interested though. So for me personally, I've got I'm planning on semi-retiring from the development business very, very soon again. And I'm really into trying to support and encourage and rebuild the industry of smaller developers and house builders, because I don't think the housing crisis will ever be solved without those. The big guys on their own, they just can't do it all. And in fact, they probably, there were lots of small sites, a bit like 50 years ago, there were lots of little builder contractors that might build 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50 houses a year. The houses actually that the NIMBYs will now be living in, really well designed, detailed, individual homes, not massive estates, the sort of stuff that now lots of people actually aspire to, some of the best homes in areas. How do you think all this is going to work on smaller sites? Because I can imagine, for example, I know you've got a sort of big one in West London. I think so. I don't know if that's sort of public knowledge or something that you want to talk about or whatever. But I can absolutely see how it would be easy to get support in a sort of dense London area that's got lots of renters and lots of young people that really need somewhere. But let's just pick maybe somewhere a little bit more suburban where you're just, I don't know, you put in 5 houses in a gap somewhere or something like that. So it is much more sort of local, and I guess the sort of area where you probably do get more NIMBYs because people are more directly affected, and there are probably less people. Yeah. The numbers are different. How anything to say about that?
Yeah, well, I'll come back onto the smaller schemes in a minute, but just the first thing to say is we are finding supporters everywhere. So this month, for example, we've had schemes approved. We've had 260 homes approved in Horsham and a Greenbelt site. We've had a 100% affordable housing scheme approved in Cambridgeshire. We've had a scheme working with Barratt's in the Midlands for about 100 homes approved, and we've had a build-to-rent scheme in Reading. So a whole variety of areas. We are finding supporters, and we are getting those supporters to engage in the planning system and submit comments of support. But you're absolutely right. If you're in West London, where you've got a big population, a much bigger population than, say, a smaller district to start with, but then you've also got the better demographics from our perspective, which are more younger people, more renters. We know that we're going to get more support from those groups. So that in terms of numbers, we will get more numbers in those types of areas but we will still get 50, 60, 70 supporters, whether that's in a small district in the southeast or up in Scotland or whatever. We can still find, across the country there are people that will support development, and they can be engaged. I think the issue for most of the schemes we work on, I think probably the smallest ones are probably around about 50, 60 units, and then we work, all the way up to much bigger regeneration schemes. So I think there is a viability. I don't think the sort of schemes that the small schemes of 5 units here, they've got so many costs on them already, because they've got to do all sorts of environment, and in many ways I think we need to be looking at ways in which we can reduce some of those. It seems just absurd that they are having to do the same sort of environmental assessments as a scheme to build 500 units somewhere. Yep. So I think that needs serious looking at. But what I hope is that, one of the things that we're doing is that we are creating a positive narrative around housing generally. And what has happened, I think, over the last 20, 30 years is that because the way that developers have engaged in the main, they've created a perception that everyone is against development. That has made it more likely that councillors will refuse planning applications. And it's also then put pressure on national policymakers to make the whole planning framework more difficult across the board. So my view is if we can start, the bigger developers can start sort of engaging supportive audiences and bringing those voices out, that will have an impact across the board. Mm. And, if you're on a planning committee and, could you imagine, in say 6 years' time, people are just used to people saying we need more homes. And the reason they're used to that is because the bigger schemes are getting the sort of positive voices. It means that when smaller schemes then come forward, that will be the attitude, and it will be so much easier to get those schemes through as well. So I think what we're doing will ultimately help those sorts of smaller projects, but there's probably going to be a bit of a time lapse before you see that come through. The piece of advice I would give to any developer, the positive thing, of course, these guys have got is they often are local themselves. They are often working in areas where they live or they've got very good connections, and use those connections and talk to people and encourage those sort of voices, because they are voters, they are electors in their area, and even if you can get 5, 6 supporters, it is better than having none.
Yeah, and I do think lots of the smaller developers, they do some fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
There's some really good small developers that want to create the type of housing that I think lots of people will be happy with. I totally get why. It's interesting actually. There was a just in this week's Evening Standard, Kevin McLeod from Grand Designs did a big write-up about house building and development, and I'm actually going to do a podcast on that, because a lot of it I agree with it, a lot of it I don't. He's just completely got it, got it wrong. But one of the things that I sort of do agree with, and I know people don't like, is they talk about. Well, I worked for Barratt's 20 plus years ago, right? When they weren't as good a developer as they are now. I actually think Barratt's are good, but I guess because they have a big name, that people talk about Barratt boxes and identikit houses and stuff like that. Barratt's don't really do that anymore. I think, but a lot of volume house builders, some of them do still, unfortunately, build shite. And that doesn't help, does it? Yeah. The whole narrative around greedy developers and identikit housing and all this type of stuff.
Yeah. Well, Paul, we're sat in one of your developments. I'd never been here until today. It looks absolutely amazing. I read about it in the Evening Standard because it was award-winning, but it really is stunning. And a bit of advice to you, a bit of advice to the development industry. The development industry spend almost all of their PR and comms budget either at the pre-planning stage to get them planning, or the sales and marketing stage to sell these. And it means that when you sort of engage with councillors, all they see of the development industry are all the negativity and the protest at this stage. So now you've got this, and this is not just for you, but the development industry as a whole, why don't you invite the councillors along and see the product? Because one of the things that I found is that the vast majority of councillors don't really know the difference between one developer from another, and therefore, your reputation is only as good as your weakest link. And if they see sort of poor development in their area, it's going to make them more likely to want to object. So, once you've got fantastic sort of community, this is an amazing sort of place that you built here. Bring them along, let them see, so they can see that you can build in the green belt, you can build really innovative developments, you can create great spaces. I know that this is linked with all the biodiversity improvements. It is much better to tell councillors once it's built and they can see it with their own eyes than just what's on the plan. So I think the industry as a whole probably needs to do far more of that. It needs to be celebrating its successes with those key decision makers, and I think it's something which we probably in the main don't do as an industry.
It's a really good point. It's a really good point. But so a couple of things to mention around that is one, from a smaller developer's point of view, I'm never going to expect anyone to feel sorry for property developers, but it is a really hard, risky business, which is why we've got so few of them. Yeah. I know. I say things like that. I think there are certain people out there, planners, the general public, and stuff like that. They don't believe you. Right? They think, it's all easy. You're all making fortunes and stuff like that. Well, if we were, the number wouldn't have dwindled to the extent that it has. If it was easy and you all make fortunes, there'll be a lot more people doing it, right? So the sort of proof, I think, is in the pudding there in terms of that. And so I suppose for a lot of us, that we're sort of day-to-day firefighting, trying to get planning and get things built and juggle finance and all the rest of it, to sort of look at the bigger or longer term picture of promoting ourselves. So that is I think that probably keeps a lot of people busy and tied up. So that's one thing to mention. The other thing to mention is again, I totally agree. That's why I try to do what we're doing here. And another business I started 10 odd years ago now, Millbank Land Academy, to try to support and encourage more smaller developers and help them do things the right way, and get rid of the type of developers and the type of development that gives us all a bad name. Yeah. So I 100% agree with what you're saying there. Final sort of little question for you though is, one of the things I've found in recent years is planning committee. Years ago, you would be able to have a chat with the local planning committee member. You might go to the ward councillor and just say, look, this is what we're proposing, talk them through things, get a bit of feedback, see how you could, incorporate their views and get them involved. Nowadays, they are very often so shit scared of being seen to even talk to a developer for fear of, all the accusations that might come with that it's not an easy thing to do. So and I will see if I can get local councillors here, but it's not that easy for a developer to engage with them, which is probably where you guys come in again, I suppose.
Well, our primary interest is the wider public, because we think focusing on the public and has a bigger impact on councillors. If councillors are hearing from their own voters, it's going to have a bigger impact than if they hear from a lobbyist or a PR consultant. That's why our approach is very much based on that. But I think the issue about sort of councillor engagement, it varies from borough to borough. Some have a culture where they're under very, very strict rules, don't speak to developers. Others are under, well, you can speak to developers, but you've got to have a planning consultant or a planning officer present. And you get others who are quite happy and open and sometimes you get sort of some councillors within a borough quite happy to engage, and others that aren't. I personally think it would be much better if there was more open and transparent discussion at an early level with councillors. We worked on a scheme quite recently in which we had the 3 ward councillors come along, and one was really, really difficult, and two just kept their views to themselves. And the one that was really difficult, I thought, would vote against us. The developer ended up making quite a lot of changes to the scheme in response to that councillor's view. And when it went to committee, all three of them had negotiated their way onto the planning committee somehow. But the one that was really problematic voted in favour. Wow. And said, they've listened to me, they've listened to the community. And the other two that didn't say anything basically then put the boot in at committee and were really anti. Really? And I just thought, well, why couldn't you raise these points at an earlier stage and we could see if we could address them? So I think there should be a better dialogue, and whether that needs, and I know there are concerns about lobbying, and maybe that needs to be in a transparent and open way, and we need to look at that. But it's so much better, surely, for the process if councillors have got legitimate concerns and anxieties about the scheme, that these are raised early, that they can be looked at and addressed, rather than you wait all the way to the planning committee and then they say, we're totally opposed to this. You've just wasted maybe 9 months of work that could have been sorted out earlier.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And to be honest, it's probably the main reason I wanted to start doing this podcast is because the sooner, we can talk to committee members, the public, everyone involved in the process, developers, planners, architects and consultants, and really understanding things, from the other point of view. And because we've all got big issues to deal with, whether it be keeping your local voters happy or whatever it might be. So the sooner we can all work together and collaborate rather than fight, then hopefully the sooner we can get more good quality housing created. So that's what it's all about, and it's great that you are definitely helping with that. So I guess that's it really. I mean, I would definitely be in touch for your help. I mean, I think that those statements of community support are fantastic. I mean, it sort of sums it up really. Have I summed it up well, or could you sum it up better?
You've done a great job, Paul. But thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. I think what we're doing at Shared Voice and through our Just Build Homes, purpose-built YIMBY brand, is trying to rethink planning communications. It's trying to bring supportive audiences into the debate, and bizarrely, we think that might be a radical idea, but it's pretty obvious, really. You should be doing that, and the industry haven't been doing that for 40, 50 years, and we're trying to radically change the way the development world engage, and we're really keen to talk about it. So thank you very much for inviting me to come along today.
Brilliant, I love it. Okay, lovely. Thanks, Wyn.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week, where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together we can all help create better places, spaces and homes, and a much more beautiful world.